My friends, today I won't just be telling you the story of a ship. Today we're going to embark on one of the most magnificent and tragic journeys of all time. A massive giant glides over the waves. Its name is Titanic. Even before it was born, it became a legend. They called it unsinkable, a marvel of engineering, a pride for the wealthy, and a beacon of hope for the poor. But who could have known that this giant ship would soon find its eternal rest in the depths of the sea? No one could have imagined that quiet night, the dark silhouette of the iceberg rising from the water. Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine this April 10th, 1912. A huge crowd gathers at the port of Southampton. The sky is clear and the sea sparkles brightly. The Titanic is preparing to set sail. Aboard are the richest and most powerful people in the world, alongside hopeful dreamers from humble beginnings. Everyone's hearts are racing this journey as a new beginning. Humanity is about to conquer the vast oceans and sail into new worlds. The Titanic is not just a ship, it's a symbol of an era, a representation of hope. But fate, my friends, fate had other plans. This journey turned into one of the greatest disasters in history. Now we will embark on this epic voyage together. We'll explore every detail, every moment, every face, right down to the silence beneath the frozen waters. Are you ready? Are you prepared to join the Titanic's passengers on that fateful journey? Come, let's step onto the deck of that magnificent ship. My friends, now I'm going to take you back to the moment a dream was born. It was 1907. Back then, there was fierce competition on the seas. A race was on to build the fastest, strongest ship in the waters of the Atlantic Ocean. At this very moment, the massive shipping company White Star Line rolled up its sleeves to build the largest and most magnificent ship in history. That ship was going to be called Titanic. Construction began at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast. Just think about it. Its gigantic frame rose like a mountain made of steel. Hundreds of workers toiled day and night. Each hammer blow, each spark from welding was bringing a grand dream to life. It was like a huge city, measuring 882 feet long, 175 feet tall, and weighing thousands of tons. No ship like it had ever been seen or imagined. But the Titanic wasn't just big, it was also the most luxurious ship of its time. Oh, how magnificent it was. Suite rooms were built that resembled royal palaces for the wealthy strolling on the deck. Marble staircases, crystal chandeliers, first-class restaurants. The Titanic wasn't just a means of transportation, it was like a floating paradise. Even the second and third class passengers enjoyed comforts far beyond the standards of the time. Everyone was talking about this ship. The whole world was buzzing about Titanic. What about that famous unsinkable title? My friends, the engineering genius behind Titanic's construction truly made it a legend. It had 16 watertight compartments, each designed to be able to flood independently. Thanks to these compartments, it was said that even if 4 of them filled with water, the ship would not sink. Everyone believed it, its captain, the crew, even the passengers. Headlines in newspapers of the time read, "Not even God can sink this ship." Oh, pride, what a dangerous illusion. Just think, a ship that was said to be unsinkable. People from all around the world were eager to see this engineering marvel. And finally, the big moment came on March 31st, 1912. The Titanic was launched into the sea with great fanfare. A huge crowd gathered, everyone held their breath. Everyone was eager to see how this giant would enter the water. When the massive ship finally touched the sea, applause erupted in admiration. Titanic's name was now written in golden letters on the pages of history. Everyone was talking about it, dreaming of traveling on it. But dear friends, this is where humanity made a big mistake. Eyes were dazzled by the grandeur of this magnificent structure, and they overlooked its greatest weakness, pride. The construction of Titanic reflected humanity's desire to conquer nature and the belief that technology could overcome everything. Yet even the engineering marvel behind those watertight compartments would bow to the power of nature. And humanity couldn't see Titanic's fate that day. But I can't pass up the chance to talk about the splendor of those days. Titanic wasn't just a ship, it was a symbol of an era. People looked at it and dreamed, filled with hope. No one believed it would sink. And no one could imagine that its sinking would not only be a disaster, but also the end of an age. My friends, now let's think about the Titanic's first voyage. In April 1912, the world held its breath, waiting to witness the journey of a ship. The ship was preparing for the greatest and most magnificent sea adventure in history, almost like a legend. On April 10, 1912, that unforgettable day arrived, and the Titanic was ready in Southampton Harbor. But this was not just a journey, it was a spectacle, a celebration of humanity's triumph over the sea. That morning, the crowd gathered around Southampton Harbor, admiring the splendor of the ship. The Titanic shone like a star on the waters, mesmerizing everyone. Captain Edward Smith and his crew were making preparations with an unprecedented professionalism. The crew and staff operated like a well-oiled machine, because managing such a massive ship was no easy task. The ship's enormous boilers were filled, and its steel hull began to tremble slightly. As steam rose into the sky, it seemed like the spirit of the Titanic was awakening. But it wasn't just the ship that was ready. Inside, the passengers had taken their places, all excited to be part of this grand adventure. Yet, my friends, there was a significant divide among the passengers. The class differences on board were like two different worlds. First-class passengers were luxuriating on the ship's magnificent decks and in their gold-accented salons. Among them were millionaires, businessmen, and aristocrats. The wealthiest of the time, like John Jacob Astor, had spared no expense for this lavish journey. The lounges were adorned with marble, crystal, and gold. Oh, just imagine the splendor of those dining halls. Banquets prepared by the world's best chefs were served with live music. First-class passengers were treated like kings and queens. But my friends, on the lower decks, the scene was quite different for the second and third-class passengers. The second-class passengers traveled in more modest luxury. Still, the comfort in this class was better than many had at home. They were enjoying themselves, reveling in the safety of the Titanic's waters. And of course, down in the lowest deck were the third-class passengers. Mostly made up of immigrants, these passengers saw the ship not just as a means of transportation, but as a hopeful vessel for a new life. They were heading to America to start anew. Even though their cabins were simple and cramped, they felt grateful to be on the ship and part of this grand dream. Dreams, no matter how big or small, all came together in the Titanic's massive hull. At exactly 12 p.m., the big moment arrived. The smoke rising from Titanic's majestic smokestacks signaled that the ship was about to move. As it slowly departed Southampton Harbor, those waiting on the dock were almost spellbound. This was not just a departure, it was the beginning of a new era. As the ship gradually moved away from the dock, people waved their handkerchiefs in farewell. But for this legendary ship, Southampton was just the beginning. Its first stop would be Cherbourg, France. After about a 4-hour journey, the Titanic docked at Cherbourg. Here, more first-class passengers boarded the ship, including famous couples like Isidore and Ida Strauss. They were captivated by the Titanic's grandeur, enjoying the experience of being part of this magnificent journey. After leaving Cherbourg, the Titanic set its course for Queenstown, Ireland. This final stop in Europe was where the ship would head into the open sea, sailing toward the endless waters of the Atlantic. In Queenstown, especially third-class passengers boarded the ship. Their hope for America shone brightly in their eyes. All the passengers came together, inhaling the luxury, excitement, and adventure that this massive ship offered. Passengers walking on the decks of the Titanic were in awe of its size. At night, when they looked up at the sky, the grandeur of this giant shone alongside the stars. That night, those dancing on the deck, dining with music and whispering to each other in the sweet sea breeze. They were all living a great dream. The journey had just begun, and in everyone's eyes was the hope for beautiful days waiting for them at the end of this trip. But my friends, no one knew that moment was the beginning of the end. Everything still seemed perfect. The Titanic was set to carry its passengers safely to America, seemingly ready to achieve one of history's greatest triumphs. My dear friends, let's bring to mind those peaceful early days when the Titanic set sail into the open ocean. After leaving Southampton and picking up new passengers in Cherbourg and Queenstown, the massive Titanic glided into the endless blue waters of the Atlantic. That giant ship seemed to merge with the sea, calm, proud, and unshakable. Just as the tranquility of the ocean brings peace to the human soul, the same serenity filled the ship's decks, dining halls, and corridors. During the first days of the journey, it felt like there were two different worlds aboard the Titanic. First-class passengers were indulging in every luxury and grandeur the ship had to offer. The wealthiest and most distinguished people of the time dined in lavish evening meals under crystal chandeliers in gold-leafed salons. The ship was like a floating palace, and every detail had been meticulously planned. The meals prepared for first-class passengers. Oh, my friends, they can't just be described, they have to be experienced. In kitchens managed by 5 different chefs, the finest wines from France were served alongside dishes crafted by world-renowned chefs. For these passengers, life felt like a dream where every meal turned into a feast. Imagine couples dancing to live music in the first-class salons at night. The sounds of piano and the elegant notes of violins filled the Titanic, making this dreamlike journey even more magical. Even though the ship was sailing in the middle of the ocean, those inside felt as if they were in their own palace. Women in long gowns danced at elegant balls, while men in their black tuxedos displayed their grace with dignity. But my friends, the Titanic was not just a ship of luxury down on the lower decks. Third-class passengers were also embarking on their own adventures. Their world may have been more modest, but the hopes they carried were just as grand as those of the first-class passengers. They were headed to a new world, a new life. Some were searching for work, while others aimed to provide a better future for their families. For them, this journey was a dream journey. They gathered in spacious yet simple dining halls, singing songs from their cultures. Since boarding the ship, they were finally able to breathe easily, experiencing the excitement of freedom and new beginnings. In their conversations, they reveled in the enormous opportunities the ocean offered them. In those tranquil days aboard the Titanic, there was an atmosphere where everyone, no matter who they were, felt like a part of this ship. The social life aboard was perfectly managed by the Titanic's crew. The passengers' needs were met, with services provided according to each class's capabilities. Passengers smiled at each other during breakfast, took walks on the decks, and dreamed of the future while gazing at the endless blue of the ocean. But my friends, we mustn't forget that this giant ship carried not only people but also the most advanced technology of the time. The Titanic's speed was a testament to it being one of the most modern ships of its era. It was cruising at 21 knots, a speed that would surely get the Titanic to America on time. Built to withstand the challenges of the ocean, it boasted the strongest boilers and most durable hulls, marvels of engineering. The ship glided through the Atlantic waters like a swan, cutting through the waves. The Titanic was equipped with the latest technology, and the crew was quite skilled at using it. Everything on the Titanic operated automatically, with the ship's massive machines controlling the water with great force in the lower decks. The steam engines worked constantly, maintaining the ship's perfect balance while propelling it forward at speed. Captain Edward Smith, and his experienced crew managed this technological marvel with great care. The ship was safe and sturdy in every way. That legendary unsinkable label was bestowed upon the Titanic for a reason. However, my dear friends, look at the irony of fate. While everything seemed so peaceful in the ocean's silence, danger was slowly creeping closer. Passengers were enjoying their time in the ocean's calm, chatting in the dining halls, and spending the night with music and dancing. No one could have imagined the ruthless disaster that would soon unfold. Ah, my dear friends, let's take a moment to remember April 14th, 1912, the most critical day in the Titanic's ill-fated journey. But before we dive into that night, we need to rewind a few days. On April 12th and 13th, as the Titanic glided through the vast waters of the Atlantic, the greatest fear of sailors' iceberg threats began to loom. Warnings poured in from various ships about icebergs on the Titanic's route. But what happened, you ask? Those warnings seemed to enter the crew's ears like the cold winds of the ocean, only to drift out the other side. At first, these warnings weren't seen as a real threat. The ship was equipped with the latest technology and was under the command of an experienced sailor, Captain Smith. The Titanic's hull was strong. It was touted as unsinkable, right? This sense of security and confidence was exactly what fate was preparing for its cruelest game. Captain Smith and the crew chose to ignore the iceberg warnings, believing in the ship's strength. Messages reached the bridge one by one, but either they weren't taken seriously enough, or they weren't viewed as dangers that would slow down the journey. Oh, but my friends, this chain of negligence was so tragic that it felt as if fate had scripted it in advance. While the crew ignored these potential hazards on the road, the ship continued on at the same speed. By April 14th, the sea was calm and quiet. The air was nearly crystal clear. The sky was filled with stars, and the waves were almost non-existent. Such a serene night had seemingly blown away any thoughts of danger from the minds of those on board. The ocean was silent, the sea was still, and the journey was continuing peacefully. But my friends, that very calm was actually a harbinger of the disaster to come. Captain Smith was a seasoned sailor who had navigated the seas many times before, successfully overcoming countless dangers. But this time, things were different. Icebergs were silently drifting in those cold waters of the Atlantic. It was hard to see them because the sea was so calm that there were no waves to signal their presence. This was a night where danger was truly invisible. The crew approached this night just like any other. The lookouts had taken their positions in the crow's nest, keeping watch over the sea. However, back then, there were no binoculars or radars to detect such a massive iceberg threat. The lookouts were relying solely on their eyesight, which left them blind to the impending disaster. That's why in those final hours, the Titanic still glided majestically through the ocean, with no fear or worry among anyone on board. Passengers were gazing at the stars on the deck, dancing in the salons, and enjoying their meals with great appetite. Oh, but did Captain Edward Smith, despite all the luxury and comfort, feel an inner tension? This was his last journey, his final grand mission before retirement. Did he sense the danger lurking beneath that still sea in the back of his mind? Perhaps his faith in the ship's safety suppressed even the slightest doubt within him. So, my friends, the Titanic continued to race across the Atlantic that night. Captain Smith stood on the deck under that enchanting sky, amidst the calm sea, confident in the ship's power and technology. On the evening of April 14th, the Titanic was traveling at about 21 knots. And no one, not the captain, not the crew, thought that this speed would cost them their lives that night. As the hours passed, most people on board had retired to their beds. The air had grown cold, but inside, the salons were still buzzing with activity. First-class passengers were celebrating their last evening in elegant lounges, while those in third class were having fun with songs and games on the lower decks. No one was aware of the great tragedy that would unfold in just a few hours. Perhaps this was, in fact, the most beautiful night of their lives. The ocean was calm, the sky was filled with stars, and the Titanic was speeding toward its fate. So, dear friends, as we approach the final hours of the Titanic, everything seems so calm and safe, a cruel game of fate. Iceberg warnings, the sea's tranquility, blind trust in the ship's strength. All of these elements were coming together to set the stage for one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. Now, my friends, picture that perfect seeming night as the Titanic was inevitably being drawn toward its end. Ah, my dear friends, there it was, the fateful moment on April 14th, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., the moment the Titanic would be remembered for throughout history. That night the sea was calm and the sky was sparkling. The Titanic was cutting through the ocean at high speed. Some passengers were asleep while others were enjoying the night. Everything seemed normal on board. But that quiet night was really a harbinger of disaster. The lookouts were stationed high in the ship's crow's nest, their eyes fixed on the darkness. However, the starry sky and the stillness of the sea were misleading. There was neither wind nor waves that night, making it hard to spot the iceberg in advance. No crashing waves or glimmers on the horizon. They were facing an entirely invisible danger. Then, around 11:40 p.m., one of the lookouts suddenly saw a massive white shape rising from the darkness. An iceberg was silently drifting towards the Titanic, as if it had emerged from the depths of the sea. The lookouts immediately sounded the alarm and alerted the bridge, but unfortunately it was too late. The enormous ship was speeding ahead, and it was impossible to steer out of the way of the giant iceberg. The crew on the bridge quickly turned the wheel, and the engines were put into reverse, but it was impossible to stop such a massive vessel suddenly. As the Titanic tried to avoid the iceberg, it didn't hit it head-on. Instead, it scraped along its starboard side. This, my friends, wasn't just a collision, it was a fatal grazing. The ship was almost being slowly ground down against the icy surface of the iceberg. As the iceberg slid slowly along the side of the ship, it was tearing through the hull plates on the lower deck as if they were made of paper. Oh, my friends, can you imagine that moment? The Titanic's massive hull meeting the cold hardness of the iceberg, accompanied by the painful screech of metal. The ship may not have visibly rocked, but down below, a catastrophic disaster had already begun. There were tiers in the watertight compartments along the side of the ship. These compartments were designed to prevent the ship from sinking, but unfortunately they were helpless against such a massive impact. The iceberg had torn through 5 of Titanic's watertight compartments. Oh dear friends, it was at that moment that the Titanic's fate was sealed. This was the moment when the great ship's descent began. However, the shock of that moment wasn't immediately felt by those on board. The first collision was silent. Most passengers only felt a slight jolt. Some brushed it off, while others thought it was just a minor issue. After all, the Titanic was unsinkable, right? But the real danger was lurking out of sight, growing deeper in the ship. Things started to get serious when the crew realized that water was starting to flow in through the ship's side. The crew members in the bridge sprang into action to get the situation under control. Ship designer Thomas Andrews began to assess the situation, considering the worst-case scenario. The extent of the damage from the iceberg was terrifying. When Andrews realized that 5 compartments were already taking on water, he understood that this was the end for the Titanic. The ship was designed to stay afloat with a maximum of 4 compartments flooded. With the 5th compartment also filling up, the Titanic was becoming heavier with seawater, and the bow of the ship was beginning to sink. Oh friends, think about the helplessness the crew must have felt at that moment. A gigantic and magnificent ship like the Titanic was beginning to sink. The crew immediately started warning all personnel and passengers on board. But even in that first moment of shock, no one grasped how serious the reality was. Captain Smith was giving instructions to his crew on one hand, while on the other hand, he was thinking about how he could save the great ship in those final hours. But time was running out, the water was flooding in quickly, and the Titanic was slowly being drawn to its doom. So, my dear friends, the Titanic's magnificent journey began to transform into a great tragedy with that inevitable collision with the iceberg. The silent disaster that began at 11:40 p.m. marked the moment when blind faith in the ship's power was shattered. And now, the hours were starting when the Titanic was racing towards its deadly fate. Ah, my dear friends, we're about to witness the moments when the Titanic's grand journey took an irreversible turn. Right after the collision, at first no one understood that it would lead to such a huge disaster. The passengers believed they were aboard the world's largest and safest ship. A few passengers felt only a slight jolt, while others got out of their beds to figure out what was happening. But the confidence in the ship's massive structure led to underestimating this minor disturbance. However, my dear friends, things were getting serious on the lower decks. The crew members observed the effects of the collision and noticed the water level rising rapidly, facing the horrifying truth the Titanic was sinking. Thomas Andrews, one of the ship's engineers, saw the extent of the damage and immediately reported it to the captain. There was no way to save the ship anymore. All the passengers and crew on board were now at the mercy of whatever moves could be made to survive. Ah, that was the moment when chaos began on the ship. The first waves of panic started spreading everywhere. People were trying to understand what was happening, and anxiety and fear were escalating. But once the reality fully sank in, that's when chaos erupted on the Titanic. The crew began warning passengers and directing them urgently to the deck. At that time, the third-class passengers on the lower decks were largely unaware of what was going on. It took longer for information to reach them, making it harder for them to get up to the deck. This only deepened the chaos. Panic spread like wildfire as passengers realized the extent of the damage. They began rushing toward the lifeboats. But here we faced one of Titanic's biggest weaknesses, the lifeboats. There weren't enough lifeboats on the Titanic to carry all the passengers and crew. The ship had only 20 lifeboats, which could save just half of the 2,224 passengers and crew. The White Star Line had such faith in the unsinkability of this giant ship that they deemed it unnecessary to equip it with enough lifeboats. The principle of women and children first kicked in during this chaotic moment. But this principle caused major problems in practice. Many male passengers stepped back to allow women and children to board the lifeboats first. However, managing this process proved difficult. People began shoving each other in fear, struggling to reach the lifeboats. The efforts to prioritize passengers based on their class highlighted the social divisions on board. Wealthy passengers had already secured spots on the deck and could access the lifeboats more easily, while third-class passengers were trapped in the lower levels, racing against time to get to the upper deck. The panic on the deck mixed with everyone's terrified expressions. As the lifeboats were lowered, some were left empty. Organizing a lifeboat filled with fear was becoming increasingly difficult. Initially, some lifeboats were lowered before they were completely filled, leading to even more potential rescues being lost. Picture that moment in your mind, my friends. On a dark night filled with stars, the colossal ship sinking in the middle of the ocean, and thousands of people fighting for their survival. Captain Smith was calmly instructing the crew to direct the passengers. But the situation was spiraling out of control. As passengers realized the ship was taking on water, they rushed toward the lifeboats in desperation. The crew struggled to manage this process amid the chaos. The principle of women and children first looked good on paper, but in practice, many issues arose. Those moments, dear friends, marked the transition from the Titanic's proud past to a tragedy. As the lifeboats hit the water levels in the ship's other sections were rising rapidly, dominating the remaining passengers with fear and panic. That magnificent ship's journey had now turned into a fight for survival. Ah, my dear friends, as the Titanic sank into the dark depths of the ocean, time seemed to stand still for those left aboard. As the massive ship slowly went down, hundreds of people's hopes for survival were dwindling, and it felt like a fight for life and death. Those who managed to get into the lifeboats were relatively safer. They had increased their chances of survival by drifting in the cold sea. But for those left behind, there was only a silent fear and helplessness on that enormous ship. These moments were among the most painful experiences humanity has ever faced. Most of those getting into the lifeboats were women and children. However, even those in the lifeboats couldn't guarantee their survival. The sea was mercilessly cold that night. The people sitting in the lifeboats trembled as they stared into the darkness of the ocean, watching helplessly as their loved ones waited behind. As the lifeboats were lowered into the water, the number of passengers left on the ship decreased, yet many still waited in despair on the deck. Everyone looked at each other, hoping for a miracle. But that miracle never came, my dear friends. And then there was that moment. The musicians. To provide some comfort to those left behind, they continued to play until the very end. A group of brave musicians took their violins in hand with great composure and accompanied those terrifying moments with elegant music. The melodies of the music echoed on the deck of the sinking ship, offering some solace to the passengers. As they played nearer, my God, to thee many people witnessed that sorrowful scene with tears in their eyes. Even in those moments of despair, the music demonstrated how resilient the human spirit could be. Those remaining on deck had to accept their fate. As the angle of the ship increased, people struggled to find something to hold on to. In fear and panic, some attempted to jump into the water, but the icy waters of the Atlantic gripped them like a vise. Most of those who couldn't reach the lifeboats fell into the water and lost their lives within minutes from freezing. That night, the dark waters of the ocean became the graves of many. And my dear friends, the most horrifying moment of the Titanic's sinking had arrived. After hours of this terrifying wait, the ship suddenly split in two with a loud crash. The hull of the massive ship broke apart due to the pressure. The stern remained afloat for a while longer before being rapidly pulled under the water. This scene showed just how vulnerable the greatest engineering marvel of its time was against the ruthless power of nature. The bending of metal and the sinking of massive pieces felt like the collapse of a giant unable to contend with a titan. The sinking of the ship was not just an engineering disaster. My friends, it was also a tragedy for humanity. As each part of the ship sank, the moments of those inside desperately trying to hold on revealed just how fragile the human spirit is. This technical failure was merely a reflection of the human catastrophe that was unfolding at that moment. As the ship broke apart, many people fell into the water, and the cold waves swiftly pulled them down. The lifeboats were filled with the few fortunate souls who had to witness this tragedy. Thus, the Titanic's journey, which began as a magnificent ship, left only cold, deep darkness behind for those who remained. As the great ship sank into the depths of the ocean before the eyes of those who survived, this tragedy that went down in history would be remembered forever alongside the human drama experienced that night. My friends, as I recount those moments, I still feel a chill within me. This event was not just a shipwreck, it was one of the greatest lessons in human history. No matter how big or strong we may be, it reminds us once again that we are all small and fragile in the face of nature's power. My dear friends, on that dark night, fate was cruelly colliding with human will in the cold depths of the Atlantic. The Titanic was a dream for those who couldn't believe it would sink, but that grand ship, that floating city, realized far too late just how helpless it was against the massive waves and ice. As the water slowly swallowed the ship, fear, shock, and glimmers of hope filled the passengers' eyes. Some waited hopefully, thinking they would survive, while others felt they had no choice but to plunge into the icy waters. Those moments marked the inevitable approach of the Titanic's fate, a battle against destiny being drawn down into the depths of the sea. While lights still shone on the deck, people in the flooded compartments below struggled helplessly. Part of the ship was submerged, while the stern rose higher into the sky. As time passed, the cold gray waves of the Atlantic seemed to embrace the Titanic, mercilessly crushing its metal hull. As the bow disappeared into the depths, those left behind awaited that final moment when they would surrender themselves to the icy waters. The majestic ship, gliding on the surface with all its grandeur, had now truly become wreckage. Just imagining that moment of horror sends chills down one's spine. And then, when the Titanic was completely pulled under, those left behind began to hear only the silence of death. The people who fell into the water found themselves in the middle of a life or death struggle. Would those fighting for survival end up smiling compared to those lost with the ship, or would the cold water take them too? This was the greatest uncertainty of that moment. As the icy Atlantic enveloped them, their fight for survival was just beginning. Hands clung to life vests in the freezing waters. In most of their minds was just one thought: to survive. Those who fell into the sea were battling a foe much harsher than rocky cliffs, the brutal cold of the Atlantic Ocean. That night, the water temperature was below 0°C. The cold seeped into their bodies, freezing their breaths. Once people got past the initial shock of hitting the water, the real danger began: hypothermia. The human body couldn't withstand such cold for long. In just a few minutes, fingers and toes went numb, and then the whole body would begin to tremble. Thoughts became foggy, strength slowly drained away, and eventually the body would give in. The hope of survival was dwindling, but still, people continued to fight. Reaching the lifeboats was nearly impossible. That night, the Titanic had only a limited number of lifeboats, and these boats were far from full. Most of the lifeboats were already occupied, and those who fell into the water struggled to reach them. However, many lifeboats didn't turn back because they were afraid of the people in the water, and only a few of the returning boats managed to save those on the brink of freezing. Those in the boats, watching the Titanic sink from a distance, had to silently listen to the screams fading into the water. As time went on, the sounds diminished, and the deadly cold enveloped everything. But this was a moment of fate. Very few among the survivors managed to stay alive. Hypothermia was so swift and merciless that many of those still in the water lost consciousness in a short time. Sadly, most of those fighting against the sea lost that battle. Their stories silently vanished into the cold waters of the Atlantic. The bodies floating on the surface became part of the dark legacy left behind by the Titanic. Every soul trying to survive that night faced the relentless power of the sea, the cold and death. The sinking of the Titanic was perhaps the greatest test of those people's lives. And that test was the story of those lost in the endless depths of the Atlantic. On that dark night, as helplessness and fear ruled the moment, humanity was desperately waiting for a miracle after those terrifying hours when the Titanic sank into the depths of the sea. The silence created by the sinking was filled with screams echoing over the water and the breathless sounds of those fighting to survive. But in the middle of that vast ocean, all anyone could hear was the deep whisper of despair. No one knew where or how salvation would come. In the icy Atlantic, apart from those sheltered in lifeboats, very few people facing death in the ocean could see a glimmer of hope. But then, at that moment, a spark of hope appeared on the horizon. The RMS Carpathia was like a hero rushing to help after this massive disaster. Carpathia was the first ship to respond to the Titanic's desperate call for help. Hours earlier, when it learned about the Titanic's dangerous situation, this steamship immediately set off to help, putting aside its entire journey. Oh, my dear friends, just think. Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia didn't hesitate when he was woken from his sleep in the middle of the night to rush to the rescue. He knew that all his crew faced an emergency. They quickly sprang into action, channeling all their energy into answering Titanic's distress call. But the sea was so cold, and the distance was so great that reaching the Titanic before it sank was impossible. By the time Carpathia, filled with passengers holding on to hope, reached the Titanic, the great ship had already gone down. All that remained were bits of wood floating among the waves and a few lifeboats on the cold water. When the Carpathia first reached the Titanic's passengers, they were facing not just a wreck, but the stories of survivors. Captain Rostron and his crew worked tirelessly to rescue every passenger struggling to stay alive in the frigid Atlantic. The people gathered in the lifeboats were battling cold, fear, and exhaustion. Each one was waiting for hands that would carry them from the icy waters to the warm safety of Carpathia. As each lifeboat slowly approached the Carpathia, the survivors wore the same expression: confusion, horror, and gratitude. That night, the rescue operation was not just a physical effort, but also a struggle to revive the spirits of those who survived. Among those placed in the lifeboats were individuals who had witnessed the ship sinking, leaving friends and family behind in the depths of the ocean. As they climbed aboard the Carpathia with tears in their eyes, none of those experiencing that moment would ever forget this tragedy. Those clinging tightly to their life jackets had perhaps just hours before been leisurely walking the decks of the Titanic. Now, after facing death in the middle of the cold ocean, they were thankful for every second they were saved. The first groups brought onto the Carpathia were in a state of desperation and shock. Each had a different story. Some had lost their families, while others had left their nearly frozen bodies on Carpathia's warm deck. Captain Rostron and the crew did everything they could to keep them safe. They worked to warm and comfort the survivors with blankets, hot drinks, and medical assistance. However, the shadow of the Titanic's sinking loomed heavily in the minds of those rescued that night. Throughout the rescue operation, the crew searched desperately for any more survivors waiting in the lifeboats, reaching out from the icy sea. As the night wore on, the Carpathia had collected all the remaining lifeboats and safely brought the survivors aboard. The sinking of the Titanic had left an indelible mark on these people's lives. As the Carpathia filled with hundreds of passengers facing tragedy, it became not just a rescue vessel, but a refuge for those who had narrowly escaped disaster. Each passenger felt as though they had regained their breath by boarding the ship that saved their lives. That night, the RMS Carpathia not only rescued those stranded at sea, but also became a symbol of hope. Like the last hero of a saga, it took the survivors from the dark seas to safe harbors. That moment was not only one for the survivors, but also a testament to the deepest strength of the human spirit. Ah, my dear listeners, the sinking of the Titanic wasn't just the story of a ship going down into the depths of the ocean. It marked the beginning of a tragedy that echoed in the hearts of survivors and around the world. When the Carpathia finally reached the port of New York, carrying those rescued from the Titanic, each person stepping ashore walked silently, overshadowed by the horrors they had experienced. It was a walk where, with every step, they carried memories of that cold night, the loved ones they lost, and the hopes that sank into the icy waters. New York Harbor was usually bustling and lively, but that day silence hung in the air. A crowd had gathered to welcome those disembarking from the ship. Journalists, with their eyes shining with excitement, eagerly awaited even the smallest details from eyewitnesses. Yet no one could have guessed that hearing from the Titanic survivors would be so heavy. As passengers stepped down from the Carpathia, they bore the weight of simply having survived. There was a vacant fear in their faces. None of them fully grasped the horror of what had happened. Reporters asked questions and snapped photos, but the survivors remained silent, unsure of what to say. The few words that slipped from some seemed to reflect the fear the cold Atlantic had instilled in them. The press was ready to capture this tragedy and broadcast it to the world. The sinking of the Titanic was more than just a maritime disaster. It was a reminder of mankind's vulnerability against nature. Newspaper headlines blared the Titanic tragedy in bold letters. Everywhere, new stories emerged about the sinking of the great ship. The horrifying details that followed left deep marks on people's minds. From England to America, and from Europe to Asia, everyone was shaken by the shockwaves of this disaster. People could only imagine the sight of a massive ship colliding with icebergs in the middle of the ocean. But beyond those imaginations lay a real tragedy. The loss of over 1,500 lives turned into a period of mourning across the globe. The incident affected not just the public, but also the White Star Line company deeply. The sinking of the Titanic cast a long shadow over the company. White Star Line had embarked on the dream of creating one of the world's most prestigious and safest ships, but this catastrophe left them with immense responsibility. Insurance companies and legal proceedings quickly came into play. White Star Line found itself embroiled in major lawsuits after the Titanic sank. Claims for insurance, compensation for losses, legal responsibilities. Ah, my friends, it was impossible to describe the financial and emotional devastation this immense tragedy caused in those days. J. Bruce's May, the president of White Star Line, was one of the few to survive that fateful night. But even his survival couldn't shield him from public backlash. The press began to portray May as the scapegoat for the disaster. He was accused of cowardice for saving himself and leaving others to die. Newspapers tore apart May's character, turning him into a symbol of the Titanic disaster. In truth, during those days, no one could really be blamed. The sinking of a giant ship in the middle of the ocean was a catastrophe for everyone. Unfortunately, the public sought a villain, and that villain became J. Bruce's May. The tragic end of the Titanic led to significant changes in the maritime world. Insurance companies and governments had to reevaluate safety standards at sea. Survivor accounts prompted greater safety measures on ships. If there had been more lifeboats, more people could have survived, they said. Those people couldn't help but think that there could have been more survivors in those moments of desperation. That's why new regulations were put in place. Maritime standards tightened, and it became mandatory for every ship to carry enough lifeboats. This disaster was not just about a ship lost in the cold depths of the ocean. It was also a test of the human spirit. The echoes of the Titanic resounded for many years around the globe. People were reminded once again of how powerless they were in the face of the ocean. This massive disaster left an unforgettable mark on the history of humanity. Survivors carried this tragedy in their minds for a lifetime. Some lived with the pain of losing loved ones, while others struggled with the guilt of having survived. And the world never forgot the memory of the Titanic, nor the hopes that were lost in the depths of the ocean. My dear friends, let's return to that symbolic moment when not just a ship but an entire era sank with the Titanic. The Titanic wasn't just the largest ship of its time, it was a symbol of an age. In the early 20th century, the world looked ahead with great confidence and pride. Science, technology, and industry were advancing rapidly, and humanity believed it could challenge nature. The Titanic represented this power, this dizzying progress of humankind. However, with the sinking of that magnificent ship, humanity's vulnerability in the face of nature was once again laid bare. The Titanic was the pinnacle of modern arrogance. a testament to humanity's belief in its invincibility. But my friends, the dark waters of the Atlantic swallowed that arrogance whole. The colossal ship that struck an iceberg reminded us that no matter how advanced we become, we must never underestimate the forces of nature. The sinking of the Titanic symbolized the end of an era when people thought they were invincible. The old world, which had infinite trust in technology, would now give way to a more cautious, more careful perspective. Of course, this disaster didn't just shake people's faith in technology, it also reflected the class differences and injustices in society. On that ship, first-class passengers traveled in luxury, while third-class passengers struggled for survival in cramped quarters below deck. On the night of the disaster, it was the first-class passengers who were taken to the lifeboats first. Most of those rescued were from the upper class. This harsh reality resonated around the world. The sinking of the Titanic was not just the end of a ship, it was also a reminder of how merciless societal inequalities could be. The gap between the rich and the poor became starkly visible once again amidst the icy waters. Dear listeners, there are many lessons to be learned from this colossal tragedy. The sinking of the Titanic shows us how fragile even the strongest structures can be, and how futile human arrogance is in the face of nature. No matter how far technology advances, we must remember that humanity must submit to the rules of nature. Years have passed, and many changes have been made in maritime safety. Ships have become safer. But the memory of the Titanic will always serve as a warning. So what should we, dear friends, take away from this tragedy? History teaches us not only about the past, but also about the present and the future. The lessons we learn from the sinking of the Titanic aren't limited to maritime history. These are lessons that every person should carry throughout their lives. We must stay humble, not exaggerate our strengths, and always be cautious. No matter how prepared we think we are for a disaster, nature or life can test us at any moment. That's why learning from historical events can help us step into the future more firmly. At this point, I'd like to leave you with one final message. The story of the Titanic reminds us that there's always a glimmer of hope behind disasters. The survivors experienced the pain of losing their loved ones in the middle of the ocean on that cold night. But they survived and were able to tell this story. We too must learn from these disasters throughout history and build a stronger future. And so, with the sinking of the Titanic, not just a ship but an arrogant era sank as well. Those of us left behind must always remember this tragic story to avoid repeating the same mistakes throughout history. The end of this era opened the door to a new understanding, one that is more careful and more humble. Dear listeners, history flows like a river. Sometimes the waves carry us to unknown places, and sometimes to the mistakes of the past. But each time it's up to us to pause, learn our lessons, and look to the future with hope. That's why the sinking of the Titanic and the lessons it represents will always remain a story that should never be forgotten. There are always lessons to be learned from history, and this is one of them.